Imagine a man who hates Christmas so much he can spot a piece of tinsel at 50 paces. Tonight he is given the worst possible assignment by his manager. He has to find the perfect Christmas tree for the factory lobby. In this calm and quietly sarcastic story, we follow Edward Miller as he trudges through snow, tree farms, depots and office politics, and accidentally uncovers the long, strange history of why people drag trees into their houses every winter. Get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, and let this sleepy journey through forests, factories and Christmas traditions carry you off to sleep. Chapter 1. The Man Who Hated Christmas Trees. On the first Monday of December, the factory tried very hard to look cheerful. Someone had decided that the best way to achieve this was to hang glittering stars from every surface that was not already dangerous, and a surprising number of surfaces that probably were. Silver tinsel sagged between fluorescent lights. Paper snowflakes drooped softly above the time clock. A string of plastic icicles blinked in a confused rhythm near the vending machines, as if they were as tired as the workers standing under them. Edward Miller walked through it all with the air of a man touring a museum of bad decisions. Ed was in his late 60s, tall but slightly stooped, with the efficient shuffle of someone who had spent his life on concrete floors. He was the kind of man who knew where every fuse box was, who could identify a suspicious rattle in a conveyor belt from 3 rooms away, and who believed strongly that decoration should never interfere with access to fire extinguishers. This morning, they absolutely did. He paused by the main corridor, where a length of gold garland had been taped across the wall just above the fire alarm. It drooped directly over the red plastic casing like an excited snake. Ed stared at it for a long moment. Then he carefully peeled the tape away, lifted the garland, and retaped it several centimeters higher. There, he thought. Now the building could burn in a dignified manner. A pair of younger workers walked past, balancing a box of baubles between them. One of them, a tall red-haired guy in a wool beanie, glanced at Ed and grinned. "Morning, Ed," he said brightly. Getting into the spirit, Ed made a small, non-committal sound. It was somewhere between a cough and a sigh, with just enough sarcasm to be heard but not enough to be reported. He followed the smell of burnt coffee to the break room. Inside, someone had placed a small artificial wreath on the table. It had battery-powered lights that blinked in 3 colors. The effect was aggressively festive. He poured himself a mug of coffee that had given out long ago and sat down on the edge of a chair. The wreath blinked in his direction, as if expecting approval. He regarded it thoughtfully, bringing green plants indoors he could just about understand. People had been doing that for a very long time. The world turned dark, the weather turned miserable, so a few sprigs of something alive by the window made sense. That was practical. That was human. But hauling an entire tree into the room Larry used for safety inductions, that was another matter. He pictured it. A tall spruce or fir, leaving muddy streaks on the floor tiles, dropping needles into the radiator, leaning slightly because the stand was never quite straight. People crowding around to hang fragile glass on branches that had recently been home to birds and possibly a squirrel. It made no sense at all. He drank his coffee and watched the wreath. The lights blinked red, green and blue, a small artificial storm on the table. Tom Harris came in, shook snow from his jacket, and reached for the kettle with the energy of someone who believed mornings could be tamed with enough caffeine. Tom was in his 20s, always cheerful, and therefore slightly suspicious. "Nice lights," Tom said, nodding at the wreath. "Someone is trying." Ed grunted. Tom laughed. He liked to treat Ed as a kind of grumpy mascot for the maintenance department. "There is a rumor," Tom said, lowering his voice with exaggerated drama, "that we are getting a proper tree in the lobby this year. A huge voice, with real branches and everything." Ed took another sip. People could say what they like. Management said a lot of things in December. Half of them involved words like initiative and team spirit. Most of them ended in cake. Before he could decide whether to respond, the intercom crackled into life. "All staff," said a clear voice. "Quick morning meeting in the main assembly area in 10 minutes. Please and thank you." That was Sarah Collins, the factory manager. She had a way of making instructions sound friendly, which was impressive under the circumstances. Tom sighed. That sounds like an agenda. Ed put down his mug. Meetings had a way of acquiring him, the way loose magnets acquired paper clips. He stood, straightened his back until it almost stopped complaining, and followed the stream of people out into the corridor. The main assembly area was halfway between a warehouse and a school hall. Stacks of boxed products lined the walls. A row of safety posters tried their best to look authoritative next to a crooked banner that read season greetings in cheery letters. Sarah stood on a wooden pallet, wearing a navy jumper and an expression of calm determination. Her blonde hair was tucked into a neat bun, and she balanced a clipboard in her hand like a shield. "Morning, everyone," she began, projecting without shouting. "I promise this will be very quick." There were a few tired laughs. People shuffled closer. Ed found a spot near the back, where he could lean against a support column and pretend to blend into the machinery. "As you know," Sarah continued, "every year we try to make the place a little less grey in December. And every year we say we will arrange a proper company tree, and then somehow we end up with a plastic broom in the corner and a box of tangled lights." Murmurs of agreement. A couple of people glanced guiltily at each other, perhaps remembering previous efforts. "This year," she said, "we are doing it properly. Real tree, real decorations, safe wiring, health and safety approved." She looked directly toward the back, and Ed felt a faint electric prickle of unease, as if a transformer somewhere nearby had started humming. "Which is why," she went on, "we need someone practical to take charge." Ed felt the weight of at least 20 pairs of eyes shift in his direction. Being the person who knew where the ladders were stored was suddenly a disadvantage. Sarah smiled. "Ed Miller has agreed to help us with this." There was a small ripple of polite applause. Ed blinked. That was an interesting interpretation of events, considering he had heard about his agreement at the exact same moment as everyone else. He considered raising a hand to protest. Then he weighed that against the effort of publicly disagreeing with his manager about Christmas in front of 50 people, and decided the coffee break had not been strong enough for that. Instead, he folded his arms and inclined his head slightly, the way a man does when resigning himself to the weather. "Thank you," Sarah said, sounding genuinely relieved. "Ed will look into getting a suitable tree for the main lobby, along with everything needed to make it look festive but not flammable. If you have ideas, talk to him." This last sentence was clearly directed at the entire crowd and at Ed in particular. The meeting ended with a few practical notes about shift schedules and a reminder about machine checks. People began to drift back to their stations. Tom appeared at Ed's elbow with a grin that could have powered the emergency lights. "Congratulations," he said. "You are officially head of tree operations." "That sounds almost important." Ed started walking toward the corridor. Tom fell into step beside him. "I did not agree to any of this," Ed said calmly. "You sort of nodded," Tom replied. "I was breathing," Ed said. "People do that." They reached the lobby, a wide tiled space near the main entrance. Automatic doors sighed open and closed as workers came and went, bringing gusts of cold air with them. In the middle of the floor, near a blank stretch of wall, stood a circular mark of scuffed tiles where a plant pot had once lived. It looked like a target. Tom pointed. "That spot is perfect," he said. "Imagine it. A huge green tree, lights, maybe a star at the top. The smell of fresh pine." Ed looked at the empty space. "I am already imagining the needles in the floor polish," he said. "And the fire alarm going off because someone decided real candles were atmospheric." "We do not use candles in factories," Tom said. "It will be electric. Timers, all that, you will approve." Ed said nothing. Approval was a strong word. As Tom wandered off toward the loading bay, Ed remained in the lobby for a moment longer. The place was functional. White walls, grey floor, a row of coat hooks, a cabinet with safety information. None of it invited warmth, which was largely the point. Factories were meant to be efficient, not cozy, and yet every winter people tried to make them cozier anyway. They brought in lights and little ornaments and now apparently a full-sized tree. He had spent his life maintaining things, keeping water out and heat in, making sure the world stayed neatly in place. dragging a slice of forest into the building felt like an unnecessary complication. He sighed, tucked his hands into his jacket pockets, and admitted one thing to himself. If he was going to be blamed either way, he might as well make sure the tree at least did not fall over. The thought did not feel like acceptance. It felt like surrender to logistics. For a man like Ed, that was close enough. Chapter 2. A simple task that is not simple at all. By Tuesday morning, the idea of the tree had settled into Ed's mind like a pebble in a shoe. Small, persistent, and impossible to ignore once you noticed it. He sat at his desk in the maintenance office, a cramped room wedged between the boiler room and the back stairwell. The radiator hissed quietly. A wall calendar showed a glossy photograph of a forest that someone had thought would be inspiring. In the picture, sunlight streamed through tall trees. None of them were indoors. On the desk lay a clipboard with a fresh sheet of paper. At the top, in his neat block letters, Ed had written 3 words: Tree Requirements List. Underneath, he began to add points. 1. Height. Tall enough to look impressive in the lobby, but not tall enough to scrape ceiling tiles or interfere with smoke detectors. 2. Width. Broad, but not so broad that people would have to squeeze sideways past it on the way to the time clock. No wanted to russet branches at 7 in the morning. 3. Stability. Trunk not warped, base solid, no wobble. He underlined that twice. Nothing irritated him more than objects that leaned when they were supposed to stand up straight. 4. Needle situation. It would shed, of course, that was what trees did when removed from their natural habitat. But there was a difference between natural shedding and dramatic collapse. He wrote moderate needle drop acceptable, daily sweeping required. He sat back reading the list. It looked less like a festive plan and more like a risk assessment. That was comforting. Sarah appeared in the doorway, knocking lightly on the frame. "How is our tree project manager?" she asked. "Conscious," Ed said. "Good start," she replied. She stepped into the office, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. Spare parts on the shelves, neatly labelled. Coils of cable. A poster about hearing protection that had faded at the edges. "I have a budget for you," she said, placing a folded sheet of paper on his desk. "Roughly this much for the tree, stand, and anything else you need. If it is a little higher for safety reasons, we can talk." He opened the paper. The number was not generous, but it was not insulting either. Enough for a decent tree and some equipment if he did not go wild on glitter. That would be easy. He had never gone wild on glitter in his entire life. Sarah smiled. "The main thing," she said, "is that it feels welcoming. It does not have to look like a shopping mall. Just something that says we made an effort." "We are a factory," Ed said. "Our main message is usually mind the forklift." "Then this will be a nice change," she replied. She nodded at his list. "You have a plan." "I am not surprised." "Plans reduce surprises," Ed said. She laughed softly. "Let me know if you run into trouble," she said. "People will want to help, though, so I suspect you'll have a more enthusiastic committee than you actually wished for." "That is one of the risks I have identified," he answered. She shook her head, still smiling, and left. Alone again, Ed picked up the phone book that lived under his monitor. He could have searched online, but habit was a powerful thing, and besides, the book did not require a password. He found the section for garden centers and landscaping suppliers. Several listed Christmas trees during the season. One of them, Greenfield's Garden Center, was only a short drive or bus ride away, on the edge of town near the ring road. That would do. He called, spoke to a weary-sounding assistant, and confirmed that yes, they still had trees. Yes, some of them were tall. No, they did not deliver, but he could arrange transport separately through a local company. The assistant added, with the resigned tone of someone who had had this conversation many times already, that the best trees tended to go early, office orders, hotel lobbies, and so on. Ed thanked them and hung up. He looked at the calendar on the wall. The 2nd week of December. Not early, not late, somewhere in the middle. The time in any process when problems like to appear. He pulled on his jacket at the end of his shift and stepped out into the late afternoon gloom. The sky above Milford was a flat, uniform grey. Streetlights were already flickering on, casting yellow halos on wet pavement. The bus to the retail park was almost empty. He sat near the back, listening to the gentle rattle of the windows. Rows of small terraced houses slipped past, some with faint shapes of trees glowing behind curtains. Little points of light, gently defiant against the early dark. He tried not to be influenced by that. People could do what they liked in their living rooms. The bus stopped outside a wide, low building with a sign that promised plants, tools, and seasonal delights. The car park was half full of vehicles, most of them with fogged windows and tired-looking drivers. Inside Greenfield's warm air hit him along with the smell of soil, fertilizer, and a faint hint of cinnamon from a seasonal display of candles. Someone had set up a corner with plastic reindeer and a fake snow machine. A child stood in the drifting foam, shrieking with joy, while a parent filmed on a phone. Ed walked past them toward the outdoor section, where the trees were. They stood in rows under a long canopy roof, trunks resting in shallow wooden troughs. Many were wrapped tightly in netting, their branches pulled in like travelers on a cold train platform. Others stood unwrapped, their dark green arms spread, as if ready to embrace whoever chose them. It might have been a peaceful scene if not for the low background buzz of customers arguing quietly over which tree looked fuller and whether it was too tall for the ceiling at home. A young employee in a green jacket approached, armed with a clipboard and the slightly glazed expression of someone who had already answered too many questions about the difference between spruce and fir. "Looking for anything in particular?" the employee asked. Ed gestured toward the general mass of needles and bark. "Tree," he said. "For a factory lobby. Tall but not ridiculous. Stable." The employee nodded. "We had a few really good tall ones this morning," they said. "A hotel in town came and reserved most of them, though. Offices too. The big straight ones go fast." Of course they do, Ed thought. The world was always very good at taking the simple options first and leaving the interesting problems for later. The employee led him along the rows, pointing to various trunks and tags. "These here are about 2.5 meters, they said. Those over there, closer to 3. But for something that needs to stand all day in a public space, you probably want a very straight trunk and a strong top branch." Ed inspected a few candidates. One tree had a graceful curve that would have looked charming in a living room but would drive him mad in a lobby. Another had a bare patch on one side that would require strategic positioning and possibly lies. He found dun tall tree that looked promising from the front. Dense branches, rich dark green. When he walked around to see the back, he discovered an entire section that looked as though someone had taken hedge clippers to it in a hurry. He stood for a moment, listening to the soft hiss of nearby traffic and the occasional snap of a branch as another customer tested flexibility. The employee shifted their weight. "If you like," they said, "we can call our other branch for you, but they are farther away." Ed shook his head. "If we have to call in reinforcements for a tree," he said, "it has already become more complicated than it deserves to be." The employee smiled, not quite sure if he was joking. The truth was simple. This place had trees, just not quite the right tree. And the ones that might have been right were already tagged with reserved labels in bold letters. Hotels, lobbies, corporate clients with deeper pockets and quicker decision-making. He thanked the employee for their help, walked one more slow lap around the canopy, and then turned back toward the indoor area. In the small cafe by the exit, he bought a tea that tasted mostly of hot water and a slice of fruitcake that clung together in a determined way. He sat by the window looking out at the sea of netted green shapes and the pale sky above them. This was going to require more effort than a bus ride and a clipboard. That irritated him, but what irritated him more was the faint, unwelcome sense of challenge. He took out his phone. For a man who preferred paper, he still understood that some information lived more comfortably in digital form. He searched for information about Christmas trees for public spaces. Among the adverts for delivery services and artificial options, he found an article about the history of indoor Christmas trees. He opened it with the intent of skimming just enough to be annoyed. The article described how decorated evergreen trees had begun as a custom in German-speaking regions centuries ago. Families brought small trees indoors and decorated them with candles, apples, nuts, and later with glass ornaments. The custom had spread slowly. carried by migrants and adopted by royal households. There was a section about how the tree became fashionable in Britain, when a certain royal couple were shown standing with their children around a decorated tree in an illustrated newspaper. People saw the image, liked the idea, and copied it. Later, the article explained, the tradition had crossed the ocean, adapted to town squares and city halls, and eventually expanded into large public trees in hotel lobbies and corporate buildings. Ed sat back in his chair. So, he thought, all of this because someone centuries ago decided to put candles on a tree, and because someone later thought it would look good in a drawing. He drank his tea, think of small fires and large trends. In the car park, a van pulled up near the garden centre entrance. On the side, in large letters, was the name of a local tree farm, along with an image of a neatly shaped spruce. Workers climbed out and began chatting with the staff. Ed watched them for a moment, then looked back at his phone. On a whim, he searched the farm name. A simple website appeared, with a grainy photograph of rows of trees on a hillside outside town. It mentioned that they supplied local businesses with trees for public displays. So the serious trees, he thought, were not here in the retail chaos. They were purchased directly, in advance, by people who had known in September that December existed. It was deeply unreasonable, but also steadily logical. He checked the bus timetable for the route heading out of town toward the hills. The journey would require an early start, a wool jumper, and more patience than he usually liked to admit he possessed. He closed the browser, folded the remains of his fruitcake into a napkin, and stood up. On the way out, he walked once more through the rows of trees. People turned them, measured them by eye against invisible ceilings, argued quietly over fullness and charm. The whole scene looked strangely determined. Hundreds of households making small decisions about how much tree they were willing to live with for several weeks. He stepped out into the cold air, exhaled, and watched his breath steam. Fine, he thought. If the factory was going to drag a piece of forest into the lobby, it might as well be a tree that knew what it was doing. He would go to the farm in the hills. He would pick out banned tree that met his list. He would get it transported safely. Then he would be done. He started walking toward the bus stop, hands in his pockets, the piece of fruitcake in manhand, the vague beginnings of a plan in his head. The idea still felt strange, but it was a problem to be solved. Problems, unlike Christmas, were something he understood. Chapter 3: Into the Winter Hills. Saturday morning arrived in the usual grey way that winter mornings like to choose. Edward Miller stood at the bus stop near the edge of Milford, feeling the cold work its quiet way through his boots. The sky was the colour of unenthusiastic porridge. Streetlights were still on, humming gently. The town was not fully awake. A few cars passed, moving slowly on the damp road. In the windows of the small houses nearby, pale light leaked around curtains. Here and there a faint glow suggested that someone had already switched on a tree, letting the branches soak in the artificial sunrise. Ed shifted his weight and looked down at the folded paper ticket in his hand. The route number and destination were printed in small, uncompromising letters. The bus would take him toward the hills, to a stop near a place with the cheerful name of Green Ridge Tree Farm. Green Ridge, he thought. Of course. Tree farms never called themselves something honest like Muddy Slope or Winder Field. He heard the bus before he saw it, the low rumble of the engine rising through the still air. It appeared at the top of the street, headlights smearing yellow across the wet tarmac. He climbed on board with the steady care of someone whose knees preferred stairs in moderation. There were only a few other passengers, a young couple half asleep against each other, a man in a reflective jacket already scrolling through messages, an older woman with several shopping bags at her feet. Ed sat near the middle, where the bus was least bumpy, and watched the town slide past as they pulled away. Milford shrank slowly, houses giving way to smaller clusters of buildings, then to open fields edged by stone walls. Trees stood along the horizon, bare branches scratching lightly at the sky. Frost clung to the grass in thin, stubborn patches. The bus heater wheezed into life, filling the air with warm, slightly dusty air. The windows began to fog around the edges. The older woman across the aisle shifted her bags and studied Ed with open curiosity. Her coat was a sensible wool, her hair carefully pinned back, her expression the kind that suggested she enjoyed conversations on public transport as a legitimate hobby. "Going up to the farm, are you?" she asked. Ed glanced at the leaflet he had tucked into his jacket pocket. "Greenridge Tree Farm," it announced in festive letters. He had folded it neatly in half so the cheerful illustration of a smiling tree was hidden. "That is the plan," he said. She nodded, satisfied. "Thought so. I know that look." Ed raised an eyebrow. "What look is that?" he asked. "The look of someone who has been assigned the tree task," she said. "Not of their own free will, I would guess." He allowed a short, dry sound that might almost have become a laugh if it had more time to develop. "You are not wrong," he said. She shifted Dud of her bags onto the seat beside her and leaned a little closer, as far as the aisle allowed. "I am Margaret Brown," she said. "I live in the village near the farm. I come into town on Fridays, and I can always tell when the tree panic starts. People clutching measuring tapes, that slightly haunted expression. You see it every year." Ed nodded slowly. "I thought trees were meant to be relaxing," he said. "Everyone seems very tense about them." Margaret smiled. "Trees themselves are relaxing. It is what people project onto them that causes trouble." She looked at him expectantly, as if waiting for him to invite more explanation. When he did not actively object, she took that as encouragement. "Do you like Christmas?" she asked. "I like it when equipment is turned off safely," he said. "The rest is noise." She chuckled. "That sounds about right for someone on the maintenance side." The bus turned onto a narrower road. Fields sloped upward on either side, the grass pale and stiff with cold. In the distance, darker shapes of evergreens rose against the grey sky, solid and quiet. Margaret followed his gaze. "You know," she said, "there was a time when people thought bringing a tree indoors was a strange idea." "I still think it is a strange idea," Ed replied. "I appear to have arrived late to the debate." She smiled again, but there was a thoughtful note in her voice now. "Our village did not have many indoor trees when I was small," she said. "Plenty of greenery, mind you. Holly, ivy, bits of fir. My grandmother would decorate the mantel and the front door. But a whole tree in the sitting room, that came later." Ed listened. It was easier than thinking about how early it still was. "My grandfather liked telling stories," she went on. "He said the idea of a decorated tree indoors started in the old German states, long before he was born. Families there lit small candles on the branches to celebrate in the winter, which, if you think about it for more than 10 seconds, is a brave choice." Ed pictured small flames in dry branches and shifted uncomfortably. Margaret nodded, as if she had read his thoughts. "I know," she said. "My grandfather said that was why it spread slowly. People liked the idea, but the practical parts were not ideal. Still, little by little, it travelled. Families who had seen it brought the idea home with them, and eventually it reached the gentry, then the royals, and then the papers." Ed thought of the article he had read in the garden centre cafe. "An illustration," he said, "of a royal couple and their children around a tree." Margaret brightened. "You know that one?" "Yes. My grandfather had a very old copy of that paper. Or maybe it was a later reprint. He said that once ordinary people saw that picture, the idea felt less foreign. If the royal household could stand around a tree indoors and look pleased with themselves, so could everyone else. So the whole tradition, Ed said, is essentially the result of good marketing." She considered that. "I suppose you could put it that way," she said. "Or you could say people needed something green and bright to look at when everything else was fog and mud." The bus climbed further. The town had disappeared behind them now, replaced by low stone walls and the occasional cluster of farm buildings. Sheep grazed close to the hedges, their breath faint in the cold air. Margaret shifted her bags again. One of them contained a glimpse of bright wrapping paper. "Do you remember your first tree?" she asked him. Ed stared out of the window. The question hung between them like a small ornament, unexpectedly personal. "We had a small one when I was a child," he said finally. "It arrived late in December, usually when my parents had decided they could just about live with the mess." He could still picture it. a somewhat lopsided little tree that his father had insisted was perfectly good once you rotated it to hide the worst side against the wall. Strings of electric lights that warmed up but never quite settled into a pattern. A handful of old ornaments, chipped but carefully handled. They put it near the window, he said. My mother worried it would block the light. My father said there was not much light to block. He had been fascinated at the time by the idea of something rooted in soil when weak and standing next to the radiator the next. The sheer improbability of it. Margaret smiled gently. It is funny, she said. For many people, that first tree is the one they compare all the others to, even if it was small and crooked and the lights did not work properly. Ed shifted in his seat. I doubt I will be recreating that this week, he said. The factory lobby is not going to feel nostalgic. It just needs something that will not fall over and that people will agree is a tree. Ah, she said, you have never worked on a committee, have you? People do not agree on trees. He supposed she had a point. The bus slowed as they approached a crossroads. A modest sign stood at the side of the road, pointing toward a smaller lane. In neat letters it announced the way to Green Ridge Tree Farm. Margaret reached up and pressed the stop button with an air of practiced timing. This is us, she said, gathering her bags. Us, Ed repeated. I get off here too, she said. My house is down the lane beyond the farm. I will leave you in the capable hands of the tree people. Do not let them talk you into something too ornamental, they always try. He stood and followed her toward the front of the bus. The driver opened the doors, letting in a gust of cold air and the faint resinous scent of distant trees. Ed stepped down onto the gravel at the side of the road. The lane stretched ahead, edged with hedges dusted in frost. In the distance, dark green rows of firs and spruces lined the hillside like patient soldiers. Margaret paused beside him. You will be all right, she said. You look like a man who can argue with a tree if necessary. He made a small, dry sound. Trees do not argue, he said. People do. Exactly, she answered. That is what makes them so useful. She gave a brief nod, adjusted her grip on the shopping bags, and walked off down the lane at a brisk pace. Ed watched her go, then turned toward the farm. A simple wooden sign welcomed visitors, decorated with a painted green triangle that was meant to be a tree. Behind it, the real trees waited, dark and quiet in the pale morning light. He took a breath that tasted of cold earth and distant pine, tightened his scarf and began to walk. Whatever else happened, he reminded himself, this was just a problem of height, width, and stability. The history, the memories, the opinions and expectations, those were all extra layers people wrapped around the branches. He would focus on the trunk. Chapter 4: The Tree Farm and the Accidental Historian. The lane to Greenridge was narrow and slightly uneven, the kind of road that had learned to accept puddles as permanent residents. Frost had drawn faint white lines along the edges, outlining the grass like careful pencil work. On either side, fields sloped gently upward. A few scattered sheep ignored the bus that had just passed, and the solitary man now walking along the lane. Trees stood in clusters here and there, bare branches rattling softly when a light breeze wandered through. Ahead, the land rose more steeply. Rows of evergreens unfolded across the hillside, neat and evenly spaced. Their dark green shapes broke up the pale landscape like punctuation in a long, quiet sentence. A wooden gate marked the entrance to the farm. Next to it, a small cabin with a sloping roof served as an office and shelter. Smoke drifted from a metal chimney pipe, carrying with it the faint smell of burning wood. A hand-painted board beside the cabin read "Welcome to Green Ridge Tree Farm," in cheerful, slightly uneven letters. Ed pushed the gate open and stepped inside. The crunch of gravel under his boots sounded loud in the cold air. A man emerged from the cabin as if summoned by the noise. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with a thick wool hat pulled low, and a jacket lined with something that had clearly seen many winters. His face was weathered in a way that suggested he had met wind and sun more often than fluorescent lights. "Morning," the man said. "You must be here on important tree business." Ed considered this. The factory would probably not put it in those words, he said. "I am looking for one tree." for a lobby. Good, the man replied. 1 tree is much easier than 10. Not always simpler, mind you, but easier. I am Arthur Green. Of course he is, Ed thought. A man who grows trees for a living and is called Green. Somewhere, a naming committee had been very pleased with itself. Edward Miller, he said aloud, maintenance at the Milford plant. Arthur nodded as if that explained everything, which in some ways it did. Come into the shed for a moment, Arthur said. You look like you need warming up before I make you walk up and down hills for half the morning. The shed turned out to be larger than it looked from outside. Bundles of netting hung on hooks. A stack of wooden stands leaned against some wall. A battered table stood in the middle of the room, bearing a large metal flask, several mismatched mugs, and a plate of biscuits that looked sturdy enough to survive a fall. Arthur poured 2 mugs of coffee without asking if Ed wanted any. The drink was strong, hot, and only slightly bitter, which put it ahead of the coffee at the factory. There, Arthur said. No one chooses a good tree when their hands are still defrosting. Ed wrapped both hands around the mug. The warmth soaked slowly into his fingers. So, Arthur said, tell me about this lobby of yours. Ed explained in simple terms. There was a tiled floor, a fairly high ceiling, a couple of glass doors with automatic sensors, and a large empty space that currently looked like a mistake. The tree needed to be visible from the entrance, but not so close that it frightened people who already disliked seasonal surprises. Arthur listened with a thoughtful expression, nodding at intervals. And your colleagues, he asked, what kind of tree do they think they want? Something tall, Ed said, impressive, but not theatrical, not too wide at the base, or it will turn the morning shift into an obstacle course. Arthur chuckled. I like that. Impressive but not theatrical. You are looking for a tree with strong character and good posture, not a diva. Something like that, Ed agreed. Arthur picked up a pair of gloves from a hook and tossed another pair to Ed. Right, he said. Let us go and meet some candidates. They walked out into the open, following a worn path between rows of trees. The ground was firm but uneven, dotted with old stumps and bits of root poking through the soil. The air smelled of resin and cold earth. Trees stood on either side, arranged by age and size. Some were small and compact, their branches still filling out. Others had reached the height where they might soon be considered for indoor duty. Arthur moved with the easy confidence of someone who could navigate the rows without thinking. People often assume, he said, that these trees just appear ready-made in December. They forget that it takes years to grow one with the right shape. Trimming, spacing, planting properly, half patience, half guesswork. Ed glanced at a line of shorter trees. How long, he asked, from planting to someone shouting at it because it will not fit through their front door? Arthur smiled. For the sizes you are after, somewhere between 10 and 15 years, sometimes longer if the weather has opinions. So the tree I end up with, Ed said slowly, has been quietly getting on with things for more than a decade, and then I show up with a deadline and a wiring plan. Pretty much, Arthur said. The tree does all the hard work. Humans appear at the end and make it dramatic. They walked up a gentle slope. The view widened. From here, Ed could see the whole patchwork of the farm, along with the neighbouring fields and distant village roofs. Frost still lingered in the shadows. The evergreens stood dark and steady, their branches holding the cold without complaint. Arthur stopped beside a row where the trees were tall and evenly spaced. This is the range you want, he said, 2 to 3 meters. Strong trunks, good symmetry. Some of these are already reserved for hotels and offices. Bright plastic tags hung from several branches, marked with names or numbers. When Ed read them, he saw familiar patterns. City Hotel, Corporate Lobby, Municipal Hall. We try to match the tree to the place, Arthur said. Big echoing spaces need something with presence. Small shops do better with trees that look friendly rather than impressive. Ed studied the nearest untagged tree. It was tall, with a straight trunk and reasonably even branches. That might do, he said. Arthur tilted his head. It is not bad, he agreed, but look at the top. The highest branch, the one that should serve as anchor for a star, leans slightly to one side. It might be possible to straighten it with some effort. It might also refuse to cooperate entirely. You could wrestle it into place, Arthur said, or you could choose there that has already decided to stand up properly. Ed appreciated the logic. He moved further along the row. As they walked, Arthur talked in the unhurried way of someone who had learned that people rarely complained about free information. "You are not the first factory to send someone up here in December," he said. "Every year I see the same patterns. The person who loves Christmas and wants the biggest tree they can fit on a truck. The person who fears needles in the carpet and wants the smallest tree they can get away with. And sometimes the person who is mostly worried about health and safety. That would be you." Ed considered this. "I have no objection to seasonal enthusiasm," he said, "as long as it does not involve blocking fire exits." Arthur laughed, spoken like a true caretaker of the realm. He stopped beside another tree and touched the branches lightly. "You know how all this started?" he asked. "The big trees in public places. People wanting somewhere to hang more lights," Ed said. "Partly," Arthur replied. "But there is also the pride of it. Towns and cities wanted to show they could afford a big tree, that they cared about giving people somewhere to gather. It grew out of the older habit of having smaller trees indoors at home." He moved on, gesturing for Ed to follow. The indoor trees, he said, came first among families who could afford the space. German households decorating with candles and apples. Then the idea travelled into royal palaces. Once the royal family in Britain posed for that famous image with their decorated tree, the middle classes wanted the same thing. Ed listened. The information matched what he had read, but hearing it this way, among actual trees, made it feel less like an article and more like a story being told in its proper setting. Later, Arthur went on, people wanted something outdoors as well, a focal point. So you started seeing trees in town squares, in front of city halls, and eventually in lobbies of buildings like yours, a way for companies to say, "Look, we are part of this season too." It sounded almost reasonable when he put it like that. They reached a small clearing where several taller trees stood slightly apart from the rest. None of these had tags yet. Frost glinted faintly on their upper branches. Arthur slowed, eyes moving from tree to tree. "Here we are," he said. "This is where I put the ones that might suit places like your factory when no one has booked in advance." He walked around the first tree, viewing it from different angles. "Too narrow," he murmured. "It would look fine in a hallway, but it would sulk in a lobby." The next tree was broad and full, branches sweeping outward in a generous arc. "Too wide at the base," Arthur said. "People would lose half their winter coats to it." They paused by the third tree. This set was a little taller than Ed, with a trunk that rose straight and true from the ground. Its branches were evenly spaced, each tier slightly narrower than the one below, giving it a balanced, almost deliberate shape. The needles were deep green, tipped with a faint lighter shade near the ends. It did not shout for attention. It simply stood there looking quietly ready. Arthur nodded slowly. "Now this one," he said. "This one might be the right sort." Ed walked around it. From every side the tree held its shape. There were no obvious gaps, no wild protruding branches trying to make a statement. At the top, the central branch stood straight, with enough strength to carry a star without bending in protest. "How heavy?" Ed asked. Arthur considered. "For its height, it is reasonable. The trunk is solid but not ridiculous. 2 strong people could move it into place without ruining their backs. With a proper stand you will be fine." He stepped closer and touched the bark near the base. "This one has been here for about 12 years, he said. "Hard winters, dry summers, windy springs. It has held its own through all of that." 12 years, Ed repeated, quieted. He thought of those 12 years, season after season of standing on this slope, watching weather and passing birds and the distant village lights, growing without hurry, adding ring after ring in the dark. Now, because a factory manager had found a gap in the lobby and decided that something green should fill it, those 12 years of quiet growth were about to be cut, wrapped, and hauled onto a truck. It seemed almost rude. He walked one more slow circle around the tree. "It is slightly heavier on this side," he said, indicating Don's stretch of branches. Arthur nodded. "It has grown a little toward the morning light." If you put that side toward the wall, it will look fuller from the entrance. Ed appreciated the detail. He liked things that could be made to cooperate with the right orientation. He took a breath. "This and then," he said, "if it is still available." Arthur grinned. "For you, it is available. You found it before anyone stuck a tag on it." He took a piece of bright ribbon from his jacket pocket and tied it loosely around one of the upper branches. The colour looked almost aggressive against the dark green. "There," Arthur said. "Claimed." They started back down the hill, leaving the tree standing in its place for the moment. "We will cut it this afternoon," Arthur said. "I can have it wrapped and ready for transport by tomorrow. Do you have someone who can collect it?" Ed explained about the local delivery company he could hire and the access arrangements at the factory. Between them, they pieced together a simple plan. The tree would be cut, wrapped in netting, loaded onto a small flatbed truck, and delivered to the Milford plant loading bay late the next day. "You will want a good stand," Arthur said, "one that spreads the weight properly. I have a few sturdy ones here, metal, not those flimsy plastic bowls. We can add one to the order." "Good," Ed said. "I would rather not watch our investment slide gracefully onto the floor on the first day." Arthur chuckled. "That is a fair preference." Back in the shed, they went over the details. Height, estimated weight, width at the base, price, delivery time. It felt pleasingly like ordering a large, silent piece of equipment. Arthur filled in a handwritten receipt. His penmanship was unexpectedly neat. "There you are," he said, passing the paper across. One lobby tree with a strong sense of duty. Ed folded the receipt carefully and placed it in his inside pocket next to his wallet. "Thank you," he said. Arthur poured him another half mug of coffee. "You know," he said, "for someone who claimed he was only in this for health and safety, you have chosen that tree with more care than most." Ed considered denying it. Then he decided there was no particular point. "If we are going to do this," he said, "we might as well do it properly." Arthur smiled. Spoken like a man who has met his share of half-finished jobs. He glanced out of the small window. "By the way," he added, "when that tree stands in your lobby, it will be standing in a long line of its kind. There are trees in hotel halls, in town squares, in churches, in living rooms. Some of them look grand. Some of them lean a bit. People stand around them, drink too much tea or something stronger, and for a moment the world feels a little less sharp. It is not a bad family for your tree to join." Ed followed his gaze. "I suppose," he said slowly, "that there are worse things to be part of than a long line of trees." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of the farm outside. Somewhere a saw buzzed briefly. Elsewhere a child laughed. Eventually Ed checked his watch. "I should catch the next bus back," he said. "There is still the matter of convincing a delivery company that this is a simple job." Arthur nodded. "Tell them what it weighs and remind them that it does not complain. That usually helps." They shook hands. Arthur's grip was firm, his palm calloused with years of handling bark and rope. As Ed walked back down the lane toward the main road, he glanced back once. Up on the slope, between other trees still waiting for their turn, he could just make out a faint strip of bright ribbon tied high on a branch. From a distance it made the chosen tree easy to spot. The thought followed him onto the bus and all the way back toward town. Somewhere on that hill, a tree had been quietly growing for 12 winters. Now, because of a blank patch of floor in a factory lobby, it had been selected, measured, tagged, and scheduled. It was an odd kind of promotion. Chapter 5. Snow and Small Interruptions. The weather decided to have opinions on Sunday. By mid-morning, Milford had disappeared under a gentle, steady fall of snow. Not the dramatic sort that arrived sideways with wind and made headlines. This was the quiet, determined kind that simply kept going, one small flake at a time, until every familiar edge was softened. From his flat on the second floor of a brick terrace, Edward Miller watched the street outside turn from wet grey to muted white. Cars moved slowly. Footprints appeared on the pavement, only to be filled in a few minutes later. The world looked as if someone had turned down the contrast settings. On the small table by his armchair, his phone lay face up. No new messages. If all went according to plan, somewhere on a hillside at Green Ridge, Arthur Green and his crew were cutting and wrapping the factory tree, tying down the branches, and preparing it for tomorrow's journey. Ed believed they would manage. People who worked outdoors in winter rarely panicked about snow. It was the people indoors who tended to become dramatic. He made tea, the proper way, with a pot and a timer. There were some areas of life where shortcuts could not be tolerated. He took the mug back to his chair and sat down, listening to the quiet. The usual city noises were dulled, as if the snow had decided they were not helpful and put a hand over their mouths. On the coffee table lay the receipt from the farm, folded in half. He had put it there the night before, telling himself that it was so he would not forget to take it to work. That was technically true. It was also there because he kept glancing at it, as if numbers and scribbled descriptions could reassure him about a piece of forest he could not currently see. Lobby tree, Arthur had written, followed by a height and a rough note about the stand. Ed unfolded the paper again, as if expecting the words to have changed. They had not. The tree was still the height it had been yesterday. The stand was still included. Nothing about the weather altered that. He set the paper down and looked back out of the window. On the opposite side of the street, a family emerged from a house in a flurry of coats, scarves, and protest. An adult tried to persuade a small child into gloves. The child was convinced that bare hands were more efficient for snowball construction. An older teenager stepped out with the kind of studied indifference that suggested they cared a lot about not appearing to care at all. Ed watched them for a moment. They walked off together, leaving a pattern of footprints and an abandoned snowball that rolled gently into the gutter. His eyes wandered to the corner of his living room. There was no tree there. There had not been a tree there for many years. When he had first moved into the flat, colleagues had asked if he planned to get out. "It is traditional," they had said. "It makes the place feel more like home." At the time, he had answered with something about limited space and the hassle of pine needles. That had been true enough. It was not the whole truth. He set his mug down carefully and leaned back, letting his gaze drift slightly out of focus. The first tree he remembered had been much smaller than the one now scheduled to appear in the factory lobby. In his memory, it might as well have been enormous, but years and engineering had taught him to adjust for childhood scale. In reality, it had probably been no higher than his shoulder. He could picture the room, a narrow front room in a terraced house, with patterned wallpaper that his mother pretended not to dislike. The tree had stood near the window, wedged into a battered metal stand that had leaked a small but steady amount of water onto the carpet. His parents had debated the idea for weeks. His mother had worried about the cost and the mess. His father had claimed that every respectable family on the street would have, which had not been strictly accurate. In the end, the decision had been made late, after his father came home one afternoon with a tree already purchased, leaving his mother with nothing to do but object on principle, while also finding the decorations. They had owned exactly one set of lights. The wiring was questionable. The bulbs had a tendency to fail in chains, so that one dead bulb could send half the string into mourning. His father had set them up with great ceremony, then spent an hour swapping bulbs around until the entire set glowed faintly like tired stars. Ed had been given the serious responsibility of hanging a handful of lightweight ornaments. Most were old glass baubles with patches where the colour had worn thin. One was a slightly bent silver star that had clearly seen more glamorous days. He remembered the smell most of all. That mixture of cold forest and warm dust, of needles and old cardboard boxes. A small piece of outside world insisting on existing indoors. Years later, after his parents were gone and the house sold, he had not kept any of the ornaments. They had been old, fragile, and poorly stored. What he had carried with him instead were the fragments of routine. The debate about whether the tree was too big, the muttered comments about needles, the inevitable moment when someone declared that actually it did look quite nice. The snow outside thickened. A car moved past slowly, tires whispering on the covered road. Ed shook himself slightly, as if dusting off his own thoughts. Nostalgia, he told himself, was like tinsel. A little went a long way, and too much left a strange taste. He turned away from the window and picked up a notebook from the shelf. On the first page he had written "Tree Project," partly as a joke. Underneath he began listing tasks for Monday. Confirm delivery time with transport company. Reserve access to loading bay. Check door clearance for wrapped tree. Locate protective mats for lobby floor. Prepare temporary barriers in case some bright soul decided to test the tree stability with a friendly shove. He added, almost as an afterthought, dust off ladder and test lights before allowing anyone to climb anything. There. That felt more solid than childhood memories and snow. Tasks could be ticked off. Trees could be measured. Feelings did not come with a checklist, which was one of their many design flaws. Around midday, his phone buzzed. It was a text from the transport company. Weather may cause minor delays tomorrow. Still planning to collect item as arranged. Will confirm time in morning. Ed read it twice. Minor delays, in his experience, tended to grow if not watched. But the message was not a cancellation. The plan was still intact, simply slightly clouded around the edges, like the world outside his window. He sent back a brief reply. Acknowledged. Loading bay access available all day. He made another pot of tea, watched a small documentary or television about winter markets in other countries, half listening to a narrator talk about mulled drinks and roasted nuts, while the screen showed crowds drifting past stalls under strings of lights. Every scene, without fail, included at least one tree in the background. It was almost comical when he noticed it. Once you started paying attention, the trees were everywhere. In squares, behind stages, in corners of cafes. The world, it seemed, had collectively decided that when the light failed early, the correct response was to put a small forest on tour. By late afternoon the snow began to ease. The sky lightened from dark grey to something closer to white. Streetlights flickered on again, this time reflecting off fresh snow rather than damp pavement. Ed stood at the window once more. The day had passed without drama. That was how he preferred his days. The tree remained on the hill in his mind, wrapped in the faint ribbon he had seen from the bus, waiting. Tomorrow, if roads and schedules cooperated, it would move. He turned away from the window and began to tidy his small kitchen. He stacked plates, wiped surfaces, and set out the clothes he would wear in the morning. All quiet, ordinary tasks. He found the rhythm soothing. When he finally sat down again, the room was dim. He pressed the switch on a floor lamp. Warm light spread slowly, filling the corners. For a moment he imagined that same light catching on branches and ornaments, turning the air around them into something softer. He shook the thought away, more gently this time. The factory wanted a tree. Fine. The tree was on its way. He would see to the logistics, make sure the wiring behaved, and keep the needles from choking the vacuum cleaner. As for the rest, the memories and the moods and whatever people chose to project onto the branches, that would take care of itself. Chapter 6. The Missing Tree and the Depot Labyrinth. Monday morning arrived with that particular flavour of cold that made metal surfaces feel slightly offended. Ed stepped off the bus near the factory and watched his breath rise in thin clouds. The sky over Milford had cleared overnight. The snow from Sunday lay in amiable drifts along the pavements and on the flat roof of the factory building. Someone from night shift had been kind enough to drop a line of grit along the main walkway, which meant only a modest risk of employees testing the friction coefficient of the tiles on the way in. Inside, the familiar scents wrapped around him. Machine oil, coffee that had been left on a warmer a little too long, the faint trace of cleaning products that never quite kept up with the place. He hung his coat on a hook in the maintenance office and checked his notes. Confirmed delivery with transport company. He called the number, listening to the soft clicks as the line connected. A man with a brisk voice answered, sounding as if he had been awake longer than the sun. Milford Plant Tree Delivery, Ed said. Just confirming we are still on for today. The man hummed. Yes, he said. The item is in the system. Collected from Greenridge this morning. It is currently at our central depot for route planning. And when? Ed asked. Will it be on its way here? The man paused, checking something. Expected delivery window is between late morning and early afternoon, he said. We will send a message when it is on the truck. Ed thanked him and hung up. So far, the plan persisted. The tree existed, at least in the world of tracking numbers and depot paperwork. That was something. He spent the next hour doing his usual rounds, checking that emergency exits were not decorated into uselessness, gently suggesting that someone move a string of fairy lights that had been draped with suspicious enthusiasm over a fire extinguisher. At 10, he stopped by the lobby. The blank space where the tree would stand seemed to wait with a kind of polite patience. A few staff members passed through, casting speculative glances at the empty tiles. Tree day, Tom Harris said, appearing at his elbow like an over-caffeinated ghost. If all goes according to plan, Ed replied. Tom beamed. That sounds optimistic. I have decided to try it once, Ed said. If it backfires, I will return to my normal state. Tom laughed and went off toward the loading bay. By 11, there was still no message from the transport company. At past, Ed began to feel the familiar pressure behind his eyes that signaled irritation approaching. He checked his phone twice, then called the depot again. This time, a different voice answered. The item is still at the depot, the woman said after checking the system. There has been a slight backlog this morning, weather on some of the routes, but it should go out on the next truck toward your area. When is that? Ed asked. Soon, she said. He considered this word. In logistics, soon could mean anything from 10 minutes to sometime before the end of the week. Is it possible, he said calmly, for me to collect it directly? There was a brief silence followed by the soft clatter of keys. Well, she said, technically yes. The order is for delivery, but if you come with identification and the reference number, we can release it from the depot. What she did not say, but both of them understood, was that this would make him someone else's problem in a different building. He thanked her, wrote down the depot address, and hung up. The Milford depot sat on the edge of an industrial estate a short bus ride away. He could be there and back within a couple of hours if nothing decided to be difficult. He found Sarah in her office, gave her a concise update, and asked if she preferred the tree to arrive eventually or reliably this year. She considered. If it has gone all the way from a hillside to a depot, she said, it would be a shame to lose it at the last stage. Go and fetch it. I will clear it with the depot if needed. Ed nodded. I will bring it back, he said in then peace. She smiled. I do not doubt it. The bus to the industrial estate was almost empty. Most people who worked there drove, preferring the company of their own dashboards. Ed sat in the middle section and watched rows of low warehouses glide past. Signs announced businesses that handled things like plumbing supplies, automotive parts, and mysterious logistics. The depot building looked like every depot building he had ever seen. A wide grey box with multiple loading bays, a small office at the front, and a car park that somehow always felt slightly hostile. Trucks moved in careful arcs, reversing toward open doors with the help of beeping alarms and hand signals from staff in high-visibility jackets. Inside the office, the air smelled of printer toner and teared. A woman behind the counter looked up as he entered. Collection? She asked, already reaching for a pen. Yes, Ed said. Milford Plant Tree Delivery. He gave the reference number. She typed with the ease of someone who spent a large part of her waking hours communing with a warehouse management system. All right, she said. The item is here. Large, wrapped, marked fragile. We thought it was some kind of machinery until someone read the note properly. We can release it, but you will need transport. I have arranged for a small truck to meet me here, Ed said. They should be outside any minute. As if called by the statement, his phone buzzed. A message from a local haulage driver announced arrival. Ed stepped back outside. A modest flatbed truck sat near the entrance, exhaust puffing softly in the cold. The driver, a compact man with a wool cap and a clipboard, jumped down from the cab. Tree job, he said. You must be Ed. Ed nodded. That is me, he said. The item is inside. They classify it as fragile and slightly confusing. The driver grinned. Sounds like half my cargo. Let us get it. In the loading area, a staff member in a high-visibility vest led them to a stack of pallets. "There it is," the man said, gesturing. The tree lay on a long pallet wrapped tightly in green netting. The trunk end had been capped to prevent splinters. A tag with the factory name and a barcode was attached to the top. Even in its bundled state, it radiated a kind of quiet presence, like a sleeping animal being shipped somewhere new. "We had to put it in a corner," the depot worker said. It made people nervous for some reason. The driver and Ed studied the length. "We will need 2 of us to move that," the driver said. "Maybe 3 if it is heavier than it looks." The depot worker nodded and called for a colleague. Together, with practiced care, they slid the pallet onto the truck bed. The netted tree followed, its weight settling into place with a muted thump. Straps were secured, tightening across the bundle until it could not move. Ed checked each strap with his hand. He trusted gravity, but he trusted proper fastening more. On the way back to the factory, he sat in the passenger seat of the truck, watching the wrapped shape behind them in the side mirror. The tree looked smaller at this distance, reduced by perspective and plastic. It was easy to forget that, once freed, it would occupy a large portion of a lobby. The driver glanced at him. "So," he said, "big party planned at your place." "It is a factory," Ed said. "The party is mostly fluorescent. The tree is an outlier." The driver laughed. "My wife loves them," he said. "Trees, I mean. Every year she says she will get a small thrall, and every year I end up cutting bits off so it will fit through the door." "That sounds familiar," Ed said. Back at the plant, the truck pulled up near the loading bay. A small group had gathered, drawn by the prospect of something happening that was not paperwork. Tom was among them, practically vibrating. "Is that it?" he asked as the truck engine died. "Unless they sent us an unusually shaped washing machine," Ed replied. The straps were released. With careful coordination and some guidance from Ed, the tree was slid off the truck and carried into the loading area. Even wrapped, its weight was respectable. 2 workers on each end handled most of the lifting, with Ed guiding the movement and calling for pauses when angles became questionable. In the temporary stillness between lifts, he could smell it through the netting. Faint, resinous, the unmistakable scent of forest. It cut through the smells of concrete and oil like a memory walking into the wrong room. "Where exactly is this going?" one of the workers asked. "Lobby," Ed said, "near the main entrance." "That will surprise the visitors," the worker said. "That," Ed replied, "appears to be part of the point." They maneuvered the tree onto a sturdy trolley which complained a little but held. Ed secured the trunk so it would not roll. Then, with the solemnity of people transporting a very quiet, very heavy guest, they began the journey through the corridors. Staff stepped aside as the procession passed. Some smiled. A few clapped lightly, because people would clap at anything in December if given encouragement. Tom walked alongside, giving a running commentary to anyone who would listen. "Look at that," he said. "Real tree. Proper. Not one of those flat ones. Ed went to a farm and everything." Ed ignored that part. When they reached the lobby, he directed the trolley to the cleared space he had measured twice the previous week. Protective mats had already been laid down on the tiles. A heavy metal stand waited nearby, its bolts opened wide like a patient mouth. "Right," Ed said. "Net off first, stand after. Carefully." They tipped the tree gently upright, leaving the trunk resting on the edge of the stand while the workers began cutting away the netting from the base upward. As the plastic strands snapped, the lower branches shook themselves free, stretching outward like someone waking up after a long nap. Needles fell onto the mat in soft waves. The air filled at once with the full smell of the tree, stronger now, unapologetic. More netting came off, more branches unfolded. The shape emerged, tall, even, unmistakably the same tree he had chosen on the hillside, only transposed into tile and glass. Someone let out a low whistle. "That is a serious tree," Tom said. Ed stepped back, scanning the branches for damage. The netting had done its job, no major breaks, only a few bent tips that would settle with time. The top branch stood straight, even freed from its plastic confinement, ready for whatever indignity humans believed belonged there. "All right," Ed said. "Let us seat it." They lifted it briefly, enough to slide the trunk into the waiting stand. Once it was in position, he crouched down and began tightening the bolts, one by one, checking white-knuckle tightness by feel. The trunk settled, pressure distributing evenly. The tree swayed once, lightly, and then stood still. He stood up and stepped back again. It held. The lobby looked different at once. The familiar lines of walls and doors now had to share space with something from outside. The tree changed the sound slightly too, absorbing a little of the echo, softening the way footsteps carried. A few more co-workers drifted in, drawn by the news. Sarah arrived, taking in the scene with a slow, satisfied nod. "You did it," she said. "We did it," Ed replied. "I mostly tightened things." "That counts," she said. People murmured approval. There were comments about size and shape and smell. Someone offered the opinion that it was a bit taller than expected. Someone else declared that exactly as tall as expected was the whole point. Among the voices, Ed heard something else. He heard that brief moment, barely more than a breath, when a group of people saw something new in a familiar place and quietly, collectively, liked it. It was not dramatic, no one burst into song, there were no profound speeches, but for a heartbeat or two the lobby felt less like a passageway and more like a room that was allowed to exist for its own sake. Good, he thought, that will do. There was still work, of course. The tree would need lights and decoration, cables would need to be routed, timers set, and power loads checked. He would have to fend off at least 3 overexcited volunteers from stapling anything to anything, but for the moment it stood. A 12-year-old piece of hillside, now anchored in metal and surrounded by fluorescent lights and safety posters. Ed dusted his hands quietly on his trousers, more out of habit than necessity. The journey from Greenridge to the Milford factory was complete. The next stage, what people chose to hang on those branches and what they chose to feel when they looked at them, was someone else's domain. His part had been to get the tree here, in Nen Peace. Looking up at it, he allowed himself one small private thought that would never make it into any official report. It actually looked rather good. Chapter 7. The Lobby Debate. By Tuesday morning, the tree had settled into the lobby as if it had always been there, and was slightly surprised to find it had not been consulted earlier. It stood calmly on its metal stand, branches relaxed after the tight hold of the netting. The needles still held their deep green colour. The faint forest scent had soaked gently into the air, so that, by mid-morning, the lobby smelled less like cleaning fluid, and more like the entrance to a quiet hillside. People reacted the way they always did when something new appeared in a familiar space. They pretended not to stare, and then they stared. Ed arrived after his usual round of checking that no one had hung tinsel on important warning signs. When he walked into the lobby, there were already 3 people clustered near the tree, arms folded, studying it with the intensity usually reserved for major structural issues. Tom Harris turned as Ed approached. "There he is," Tom said, "the man of the hour." Ed gave the tree a professional once-over. It was still upright. The bolts in the stand had not shifted. No visible lean. Needle loss was within acceptable early limits. Then he noticed the expressions on the faces of the other 2 staff members. One was Claire from accounts, a careful person who liked tidy columns and tidy desks. The other was Mark from dispatch, who believed strongly in efficiency and held controversial views about the correct length of a lunch break. "It is big," Claire said. That was true. The tree reached almost to the ceiling without actually threatening the tiles. Its top branches hovered at a polite distance below the nearest smoke detector. "It could be bigger," Mark said. "If we moved it closer to the wall and rotated it, we could fit another half-meter easy." Ed regarded him calmly. "If it were bigger," he said, "people would have to slide sideways past it in the morning. We are not running an obstacle course." Claire tilted her head. "I am not saying it is too big," she said. "It is just that it makes the rest of the lobby look smaller." "That is what happens when you put a tree indoors," Ed said. "The tree stays the same size, only the room looks different." Tom folded his arms, clearly enjoying the emerging committee. "I think it is perfect," he said. "Of course you do," Ed replied. "You have not had to carry it." Sarah appeared then, as if summoned by the potential for minor chaos. She took in the tree, the tiny crowd, and Ed, and smiled. "Morning," she said. "I see we are having early reviews." Claire gestured toward the branches. "It is impressive," she said. "I just wonder if it might be slightly too much for the space." Mark pointed at the ceiling. "We could have gone taller," he said. "I'm just saying." Tom rolled his eyes. "This is exactly what the driver said," he remarked. "There is always someone who wants the bigger one." Sarah raised a hand with the calm assurance of someone who spent a significant part of her job refereeing discussions over things like overtime rota and coffee machine brands. "Let us be practical," she said. "Does the tree block the doors?" "No," Ed said. "Does it interfere with the alarm system?" she asked. "No," he answered again. "Can people walk past it without having to apologize to the branches?" she asked. "Yes," Ed said, "provided they remember that personal space applies to trees as well." "Then," Sarah said, "I am calling it. The tree is the right size." Mark opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again with a small shrug. Claire sighed gently. "It does smell nice," she admitted. Tom grinned. "There you go," he said. "Officially approved by management and accounts. You cannot get better than that." The little group dissolved, most of them heading back to whatever tasks had been briefly abandoned. Only Tom lingered near Ed. "You did notice," Tom said quietly, "that you defended the tree." "I answered questions," Ed replied, "in favor of the tree." "I will not have people blaming it for our design choices," Ed said. "It has only just arrived." Tom laughed and wandered off. For the rest of the morning, visitors and staff continued to filter through the lobby. Some merely glanced at the tree. Others stopped to stand near it for a moment, hands in pockets, faces relaxed in that slightly unfocused way of people who are letting their brains idle between tasks. Ed observed this from time to time as he passed. The tree had become part of the building already, a new landmark to orient by. Go past the tree, turn left for the canteen, that sort of thing. Around midday, a delivery driver from another company stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots. He paused, looked up at the branches and let out a small approving sound. "Good tree," he said. "Thank you," Ed replied, as if he had grown it himself. After lunch, the second wave of opinion arrived in the form of what Tom cheerfully called the Decoration Committee. 3 staff members from different departments appeared in the maintenance office doorway, each holding a box. "We were told to speak to you," said one of them, a woman from customer service whose name Ed always momentarily forgot. "About what?" he asked, though the boxes were a clue. "About making the tree less naked," she said. The boxes contained lights, ornaments, and a tangled length of tinsel that looked as though it had lost a fight in storage years ago. Ed eyed the contents. "Before you hang anything," he said, "I need to check the lights. No plugging in mysterious cables you find at the back of a cupboard from the last century." "Fair," she said. He carried the boxes to a workbench, sorting through the electrical tangle with the practiced hands of someone who had seen the full spectrum of human invention. Some of the lights were modern, low-energy sets with intact casings and clear labeling. Others bore the weary look of survivors. "These," he said, setting aside an older string, "are retired. They have lived a full life. They do not need to spend their final days shorting out in the lobby." Tom, who had drifted in with impeccable timing, nodded solemnly. "We can give them a dignified farewell," he said. "Maybe a moment of silence." Ed continued checking plugs and wires. The decoration committee watched him with a mixture of amusement and patience. "You know," said the woman from customer service, "it is nice having someone take this seriously. In other years we just threw things at the tree and hoped it did not faint." "The tree deserves functional wiring," Ed said. "So does the building." By late afternoon he had compiled a selection of lights that met his standards. He also located some extension leads with intact casings and, after some searching, a timer socket that did not look like it had been through a flood. He briefed the committee in the style of a small construction meeting. "Lights go on first," he said. "Start from the top, work down. No daisy chaining 6 sets together on one socket. We route cables along the wall, away from where people walk. If anyone tries to wrap a light string around a door handle, they will answer to me." The committee nodded. "What about the decorations?" Tom asked. "Those," Ed said, "are not a safety issue unless someone decides to hang actual bricks. I will leave the creative part to you, as long as nothing interferes with the stand or the cables." As the decoration team headed for the lobby, boxes in hand, Ed followed at a slight distance. He did not intend to supervise every bauble, but he did want to see how the tree looked under early human interference. By then, the winter light outside was already fading. The glass doors had turned into dark mirrors, showing reflections of the interior. The tree, standing near the wall, looked larger against the growing dusk. It would not stay undecorated for long. For now, though, for this brief interlude between arrival and transformation, it still stood mostly as it had on the hillside. Ed allowed himself a final look before the first set of lights went on. It had survived the farm, the depot, the journey, the lobby debate. That was not a bad record for a piece of forest in a factory. Chapter 8. Lights, Ornaments, and Quiet Evenings. By Wednesday, the lobby had turned into a staging area for what Tom delightedly called Operation Decorate. The boxes from storage had multiplied. Someone had found additional decorations in a cupboard near the training room. Another person had brought in a small box from home, containing ornaments that had been retired from their own tree but were apparently still deemed good enough for industrial duty. They were all stacked now near the tree, forming a small wall of cardboard and plastic. Ed regarded the scene with the cautious respect of a man who understood that once people were given access to both ladders and enthusiasm, interesting things could happen. He checked the ladder first. Feet secure, no loose rungs, rubber caps intact. Then he checked the timer socket and the extension leads again. Because trust was admirable, but verification kept building stand-in. Sarah arrived carrying a tray of paper cups from the canteen. "If I give everyone hot chocolate," she said, "maybe they will be less likely to climb things unsupervised." "An optimistic theory," Ed said, "but I have no objection." Tom bounced on his heels. "So," he said, "what is the plan?" Ed considered the tree. "Plan is simple," he said. "Lights first. From the inside, near the trunk, outward. Even spacing. Then ornaments. Heavy ones on lower branches. Lighter ones higher up. No clustering. Resist the urge to hang every single thing you own on one branch." Tom saluted in a way that just about escaped being disrespectful. "Yes, sir," he said. "Even spacing. No emotional clustering." The decoration committee gathered. It was an odd, cheerful little group. Claire from accounts, Mark from dispatch, the woman from customer service whose name Ed finally remembered was Jenna, a technician from quality control, 2 people from packing. They stood around the base of the tree, cups of hot chocolate in hand, listening as if he were about to brief them on a critical engineering repair instead of a festive activity. "We want it to look balanced," Ed said. "Not too formal, not too messy. Think coherent, not chaotic." He felt faintly ridiculous using those words about a tree, but there it was. Jenna sipped her drink. "What about a theme?" she asked. "Theme?" Mark echoed. "People like themes," she said. "Gold and red, or winter frost, or whatever." Tom pointed at the boxes. "Our theme is whatever we already own," he said, "plus whatever Jenna brought in from home." Jenna laughed. "Fair," she said. "My theme is sentimental clutter." They began with the lights. Tom volunteered to climb, which did not surprise anyone. With the ladder carefully positioned and held at the base by Mark, he wound the first string around the upper branches, following Ed's instructions to keep the cable close to the trunk. From the ground, Ed watched the pattern emerge. "A little closer there," he said. "That branch will look dark otherwise." Tom adjusted. The lights, still switched off, hung like silent promises. By the time they had arranged 3 sets in gradually wider circles down the tree, the cables were neatly tucked away, the plugs were routed along the wall to the timer socket, and no one had fallen off anything. By Ed's standards, this counted as a success. "All right," he said, moment of truth. He plugged the main cable into the timer, checked the connection once more, then flicked the switch to manual override. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, with a soft collective intake of breath from the assembled staff, the tree lit up. Warm white points of light appeared along the branches, not harsh, not too bright, just enough to outline the shape and pick out the layers of green. The needles glowed faintly where the bulbs touched them. Shadows shifted gently on the lobby walls. Noah spoke for a moment. Then Tom let out a satisfied sigh. "That," he said, "looks like a proper tree." Even Ed had to admit that the effect was good. The lights did exactly what lights were meant to do. They made the tree visible without turning it into a spectacle. "Right," Jenna said briskly. "Ornaments next, before someone starts a poetry reading." The boxes were opened. Out came glass baubles in red, gold, and a few odd colours that no one could quite remember choosing. There were paper stars slightly crumpled, wooden ornaments in the shape of hearts and bells, a few strands of beaded garland that had survived years of being detangled. There were also, inexplicably, several small plastic dinosaurs. "Those are mine," said the technician from quality control. My kids insisted. They said the tree needed guarding. Ed looked at the dinosaurs. "As long as they are not conductive," he said. Tom naturally claimed responsibility for placing them. The group set to work. Claire gravitated toward the middle branches, hanging baubles with the same care she applied to spreadsheets. She made sure no two identical ornaments hung too close together. Mark focused on the lower branches, where heavier items could hang without dragging the tree off balance. He also took on the role of retrieving anything dropped, which quickly made him popular. Jenna moved around the tree with a quiet concentration, stepping back now and then to check the overall effect. Tom, having been entrusted with the dinosaurs, placed them in strategic positions where children who visited might spot them. One perched near the base, half hidden behind a branch. Another peered out near the middle, as if supervising the lobby. Ed mostly supervised from a short distance, occasionally adjusting a cable or moving a bauble one notch along a branch to avoid collisions. As they worked, the lobby filled with small conversations. "That Dan there was from the first year we did this," someone said, holding up a slightly chipped ornament. "My grandmother had paper hearts like these," Jenna remarked, hanging too close together and then moving one aside to avoid emotional clustering. "We could put the star on last," Tom said. Classic finishing moves. The star in question was a metal one from the factory storage boxes. It had seen better decades, but it was sturdy, and its simple shape appealed to Ed. When the branches were sufficiently populated and the boxes mostly empty, they stepped back. The tree now looked less like a visiting piece of forest and more like a quietly confident participant in the season. The warm lights wrapped the decorations in a gentle glow. Reflections winked faintly in the glass of the entrance doors. "Time for the star," Tom said. Ed considered the top of the tree. "Careful," he said. "That branch has 12 years of standing up straight behind it. Let us not ruin its career now." With the ladder once more anchored, Tom climbed up, cradling the star. At the base, Ed watched for any sign of the tree leaning or the stand protesting. Tom slid the star over the top branch, adjusting it until it sat straight. "How does it look?" he called down. "Centered," Ed said. "Acceptable." "Only acceptable," Tom protested. "Better than dramatic overachievement," Ed replied. Tom climbed down. They switched the lights off, then on again, as if testing whether the tree would agree to repeat the performance. It did. By late afternoon, the work was done. The decoration committee drifted back to their departments, leaving behind a faint trail of stray tinsel strands. The lobby, now dim in the early winter light, felt different. The tree anchored the space. The lights provided a soft focal point for anyone passing through. Ed stayed behind to adjust the timer. "On at mid-afternoon," he murmured, setting the dial. "Off late evening, so night shift does not spend 12 hours in the dark with only the vending machine for company." With the timer set, he unplugged and replugged once more, just to be sure. As he did so, a small group of late-shift staff came through the doors, stamping snow from their boots. They stopped, almost in unison, when they saw the tree. "That looks good," one of them said quietly. "Could be bigger," another joked, because there was always Wed. They stood for a moment in the warm light before moving on toward the changing rooms. The tree did not react because it was a tree, but it held its shape with a kind of silent composure. Later that evening, when most of the day staff had left, Ed walked through the lobby one more time. He liked to do a final check before going home, a habit formed over years of dealing with leaks and minor electrical sulks. The building was quieter now. Distant machinery hummed on a lower setting. The overhead lights in the lobby had been turned down, leaving the tree lamps as the brightest points. He stopped near the center of the space and looked up. The lights wrapped around the branches in their deliberate pattern, drawing the eye upward. The ornaments hung without clashing. The metal star at the top glowed softly, reflecting tiny specks of the warm light. He realized with a faint stab of surprise that the scene reminded him of that first tree in his parents' living room, not in detail. The setting here was all glass and tile instead of patterned wallpaper and worn carpet. But the feeling, that small, unexpected pocket of calm in the middle of practical surroundings, was similar. Back then, his parents had stood side by side near the window, arms folded, debating whether the tree was too large for the room. After several minutes, they had both admitted that it made the place feel, as his mother had reluctantly put it, less dreary. Now, years later, he stood alone in a factory lobby with a tree that had travelled further and lived longer than that childhood version, and thought much the same. He would not say it out loud. There were limits. He checked that the timer would switch the lights off as planned, then shrugged on his coat and headed for the exit. As the automatic doors opened, letting in a breath of cold night air, he glanced back once. The tree stood quietly, lights glowing, as if keeping watch over the empty desk and the closed office doors. It was, he had to admit, not the worst thing to leave behind at the end of a shift. Chapter 9. The Speech and the Question. The last workday before Christmas always felt slightly unreal, as if the building knew most of the machines would soon have a brief holiday from human interference. On Friday morning, the Milford plant moved more slowly than usual. People arrived with tins of biscuits under their arms. Small gift bags appeared on desks. Conversations lasted a fraction longer at the coffee machine. The official plan was simple. Work until midday, then gather in the lobby for a short address from Sarah, some refreshments, and the polite exchange of seasonal phrases. By 11:30, the lobby was already filling. Someone had wheeled out a table and covered it with paper cloth. On it stood plates of mince pies, bowls of crisps, and a strangely artistic tower of cheese and crackers that Tom claimed to have engineered. The tree stood at the centre of it all, not moved, but suddenly more central simply because the people had arranged themselves around it. Ed stood near the back of the crowd, effectively merging into a column. He preferred watching from a position where he could also monitor the fire exit. The lights on the tree were already on, set to a steady glow. No flashing, no chasing patterns, nothing that would cause seizures or tempers. Just a constant warm light that softened the edges of the room. Sarah stepped up onto the same pallet she had used for the earlier meeting, holding a mug rather than a clipboard this time. The murmur of voices quieted. "Thank you for gathering," she said. "I know some of you would rather be halfway home by now, but I promise to be brief." There was a small ripple of laughter. She spoke about the year, eugneistic in grand terms, just in the practical language of targets mostly met, challenges mostly handled, and new staff mostly integrated. She thanked people for long hours, for flexibility, for generally keeping the place functioning despite circumstances that had occasionally seemed determined to do the opposite. Then she turned slightly, gesturing toward the tree. "And," she said, "we finally have a proper tree." There was another murmur, this time with more warmth in it. People glanced at the branches, the lights, the ornaments. "I would like to thank everyone who helped decorate it," she went on, "and especially Ed, who was volunteered into this and somehow turned it into a project that actually worked." Instantly Ed felt the weight of far too many eyes swing in his direction. Tom, loudly unhelpful, added a small whoop and began clapping. Within seconds the rest of the crowd joined in, the sound bouncing gently off the lobby walls. Ed considered disappearing through the nearest service hatch. Unfortunately, this building did not come equipped with those. He inclined his head very slightly, a gesture that could, with enough imagination, be mistaken for a polite acknowledgement. Sarah smiled. "If you see him later," she said, "try not to scare him by saying thank you all at once." The laughter that followed was kind rather than sharp. Ed felt only mildly attacked. Sarah wrapped up the speech with a few words about rest, safety, and the importance of switching things off properly. That last part he approved of. Then the formalities dissolved into general movement. People queued for food, someone turned on a small speaker, and played background music at a volume that failed to offend anyone. Ed edged sideways toward a quieter corner. He accepted a mince pie from a passing tray, more out of politeness than hunger. He was halfway through deciding whether it tasted more of pastry or nostalgia when he realized someone had joined him. It's one of the newer employees, a young woman from the packaging line called Lisa. She held a paper cup in both hands as if using it to anchor herself. "Hi," she said. "Hello," Ed said. "The tree is nice," she said. "It is structurally sound," he replied. "That is the main thing." She smiled. "I wanted to ask you something," she said, "if that is all right." He gestured with one hand in a way that meant as all right as anything else today. "Why," she asked, "do people bring trees indoors at all? I mean, I know it is a tradition, but how did it start?" Ed glanced at the tree. He could have answered in the shortest way possible. People were strange, end of explanation. But the question had the same quiet weight as some of the ones he heard about machinery. Simple on the surface, but with a long history behind it. He took a small breath. Centuries ago, he began, in parts of what is now Germany, families started bringing small evergreen trees indoors in the winter. They decorated them with candles, apples, nuts, that sort of thing. Lisa nodded, listening. It was a way, he went on, of putting something alive and green in the middle of the darkest time of year. A kind of stubborn statement. The world outside might be cold and miserable, but here, inside, we can have a little piece of something that ignores winter. He paused, remembering Arthur's voice on the hillside, and the article in the garden centre cafe, and Margaret's stories on the bus. Later, he continued, the custom spread. Royal households adopted it. There was that famous picture of a royal family standing around their decorated tree. Once people saw that, they thought, if they can have wear, so can we. So it moved into middle-class homes, then more homes, and eventually into public buildings. So it is fashion, she said. Partly, he replied. Fashion with a practical backbone. People liked how it looked, but also how it made them feel. He glanced at the lobby around them. In a place like this, he said, with long hours and fluorescent lights and grey walls, a tree of all things gives people something to point at and say, yes, we made an effort. It is irrational, but not useless. Lisa studied the tree. I never thought about it like that, she admitted. Most people do not, he said. They just see a tree. But behind that, there are years of habit. One family copying another, one town copying a picture, thousands of people deciding that dragging a tree indoors makes winter slightly more bearable. He took another bite of the mince pie. In the end, he said, it is just a way of saying, this season is here, and so are we. Lisa looked at him thoughtfully. Thank you, she said. That was a much better answer than I was expecting. I could have said, because people are strange, he replied. She laughed. I think I like the longer version, she said. She moved back toward the table, leaving him once more in his corner. Ed finished the mince pie. It tasted mostly of pastry after all, but he did not mind. As the small gathering continued, he watched the way people arranged themselves. Some stood near the food, some near the doors. Some, without quite realizing it, gravitated toward the tree, leaning against the nearby wall or standing in its shadow. Conversations flowed around the branches, plans for the break, quiet complaints about relatives, jokes about the amount of food on offer. At one point, Sarah joined him briefly. Thank you, she said, for going along with this whole thing. I was conscripted, he said. You were, she agreed, and yet you still did it properly. He shrugged. If a job exists, he said, it might as well be done well. She looked at the tree. You know, she said, this lobby has never felt that much like an actual entrance before. Usually it is just a passage. Ed considered that. Maybe that is what trees do, he said. They remind people that they have actually arrived somewhere, instead of just passing through. She smiled. That is a very poetic thought for someone who spends his days tightening bolts, she said. Do not tell anyone, he replied. Later, as the crowd thinned and people drifted off, Ed did one more circuit of the building, checking that machines were properly shut down and all the important switches were where they should be. When he came back to the lobby to collect his coat, Only a handful of staff remained, saying goodbye near the doors. The tree stood there, lights still on, branches steady. He paused beside it, hand resting lightly on the cold metal of the stand. "You have done your job," he thought, with the faint wry respect he reserved for equipment that had survived a demanding week. Out loud, he said nothing. He turned off the overhead lobby lights, leaving only the tree glowing in the dimness. Then he stepped out into the cold air, letting the doors close gently behind him. Chapter 10. Taking the Tree Back Outside. The days after Christmas blurred in the usual way. Quiet streets, oddly timed meals, television that seemed determined to prove there was no such thing as too many repeats. When the factory reopened in early January, the world outside was different only in small ways. The snow had retreated to the edges of pavements and the tops of hedges. The air still had teeth, but they were slightly less sharp. Inside the Milford plant, though, the change was more obvious. The decorations that had appeared slowly in early December now looked faintly out of date, like guests who had stayed half an hour too long. The tinsel drooped, the paper stars were a little more bent, and the tree, still standing in the lobby, had begun to shed needles in a way that suggested it was composing a quiet letter of resignation. Ed arrived early on the first day back. He walked into the lobby, took one look at the tree, and nodded to himself. It was time. The lights still worked. The ornaments still hung more or less where they had been placed, but the branches had lost some of their spring. The air smelled less of fresh forest and more of dry needles. He ran a hand gently along one branch. Needles rained down onto the mat. "Right," he said to the tree, as if addressing a colleague who had reached the end of a temporary contract. "Let it get you out of here with some dignity." He had already spoken to Sarah about the plan. The town council collected trees for recycling in a few central points. The factory, being slightly too far from the nearest official drop area and slightly too large to pretend its tree was just one more from a living room, had arranged to send theirs directly to the municipal yard, where trees were chipped for mulch. Ed liked that. It appealed to his sense of closed loops. Tree became lobby, lobby tree became wood chips fed flower beds and paths. The world might not be elegantly designed, but occasionally it managed a neat cycle. After the first employees arrived and drifted toward their stations, Ed summoned a small team. Tom, of course, volunteered before he had finished speaking. Jenna from customer service joined, as did Mark from dispatch. "We remove the decorations first," Ed said. "Box them properly. Lights come off before ornaments. Nothing gets broken if we can help it." They worked quietly, voices low in the morning calm. The ornaments came down in reverse order. Glass baubles were placed carefully into their compartments, paper hearts stacked, wooden shapes nested together. The plastic dinosaurs were returned to their original owner, who promised they would guard a bookshelf until next year. As the branches emptied, the tree looked both more itself and more tired. Without the lights and colour, it was simply a large, drying evergreen that had done its temporary job. With the ornaments packed, they moved on to the lights. Tom climbed the ladder, unwinding the strings slowly while Ed fed the coils into careful loops. No one wanted to spend next November swearing at knots. When the last cable was unplugged and boxed, they stepped back. The lobby suddenly looked bare again. The tree, stripped of decorations, stood in a way that felt both grand and faintly embarrassed. "Now for the hard part," Ed said. They brought the trolley back, the same then that had carried the tree in. Moving it out would be trickier. The trunk was firmly clamped in the stand, and the branches, though drier, still occupied a great deal of space. First, they loosened the bolts, moving slowly to avoid sudden shifts. The trunk creaked slightly as the pressure eased. "We will tilt it toward the trolley," Ed said, slowly. "No heroics. If anyone starts to overdo it, stop." With 2 people on the trunk and 2 supporting the midsection, they leaned the tree carefully down until the weight rested along the padded trolley bed. A small storm of needles fell, decorating the mat and Ed's boots. From there, it was a matter of rolling the whole assembly back through the corridor, reversing the journey from before Christmas. The building seemed to react in small ways. In departments where staff noticed the tree passing, faces appeared briefly at doorways. "Taking it away already," someone said. "Season is over," Ed replied. "Best to let it retire gracefully." At the loading bay, cold air seeped in through the partially open doors. A small truck from the council yard waited, tailgate down. The driver, wrapped in a thick jacket, nodded in greeting. "At the lobby tree?" he asked. "It has had a busy month," Ed said. They loaded the tree onto the truck with the practiced awkwardness of people handling something unwieldy but familiar. More needles fell, dotting the metal floor. The driver secured the load with straps. "We will chip it this afternoon," he said. "Be mulch by the end of the week. Parks Department uses tons of the stuff." Ed liked the certainty in his tone. "Good," he said. "That is a decent second career." Tom looked at the tree on the truck, then at Ed. "Feels a bit sad," he said. "It is a tree," Ed replied. "It has had 12 years on a hillside and a month in a lobby. That is more variety than many of us manage." Tom considered that. "Fair point," he said. The truck pulled away, carrying the tree out through the gates and onto the road. For a brief moment as it turned, the branches caught the pale winter light. Then it was gone. Back inside, the lobby felt strangely large. The scuffed circle on the tiles where the mat had been looked bigger than before. The walls seemed further apart. Sarah came out of her office and stood beside Ed. "It is amazing," she said, "how quickly you get used to it being there. Without it, the place looks almost unfinished." "It looked unfinished before," Ed said. "The difference is that now we know exactly what is missing." She smiled. "Do you think we will do this again next year?" she asked. He considered. "I think," he said slowly, "that if you leave it until the last minute and then try to buy it from a garden centre, you will end up with something that leans sadly into the fire extinguisher." "So that is a yes?" she said. "It is a recommendation," he replied. "If you want another tree, do it properly." She looked at him sidelong. "Would you," she asked, "be willing to handle it again?" His first response, fully formed and ready, was no. His second, slightly less loud, was perhaps. He settled on the safest option. "Ask me in November," he said. She laughed. "If I forget," she said, "Tom will remind me. That," Ed said, "is what worries me." The day went on. Machines restarted. Orders were processed. The ordinary rhythm of the factory reasserted itself. Only during his afternoon break did Ed find himself drawn back to the lobby. Without the tree, the acoustics had returned to their slightly harsh previous state. Footsteps echoed more clearly. The smell of coffee from the nearby break room had nothing to compete with. He stood in the middle of the tiles and tried to picture the tree as it had been the week before. Lights on, decorations in place, people gathered around it with cups and plates. The memory overlaid itself neatly on the space like a drawing projected onto a blank wall. He thought of the tree on the hillside, the ribbon tied to its branch, of Arthur talking about years of growth, of Margaret on the bus describing early indoor trees and candle flames braver than common sense. He thought of his parents' front room and the small tree that had once stood by the window, the wires that had misbehaved, the way the room had felt different for those few weeks. Then he thought of this lobby and how for a short time it had stopped being just a thoroughfare where people hurried through, head down, on their way to somewhere else. It was a lot of work, he allowed, measuring, travelling, arguing with depot staff, supervising ladders, untangling lights. All of it so that a piece of forest could visit an industrial building and stand there quietly while humans projected meaning onto it. Was it worth it? He glanced at the scuffed circle on the floor. Probably, he thought, to the people who had stopped to stand near it on tired afternoons, or to the ones who had brought in old ornaments and told small stories about where they came from. He would not say any of that out loud, of course. To anyone who asked, he would say that the tree had been a safety and logistics challenge successfully met, and that was that. Later that week, on his way home, he walked past the municipal park. Near the entrance, a flower bed lay dormant under a thin layer of frost. A worker from the council was spreading fresh mulch on the soil from a barrow that gave off a faint, familiar scent of resin. Ed paused for a moment, breathing in. There was no way to know, of course, whether the chips in that barrow came from the lobby tree or from some other tree that had stood in some other building or living room. But the chain was clear enough. Hillside, lobby, yard, flower bed. In spring, when the beds filled with plants, people would walk past without thinking about the mulch underfoot. Just as they would walk through the factory lobby next winter without thinking about the 12 years on a hillside behind the new tree, if there was one. That was how these things went. He resumed his walk, scarf pulled up against the cold, boots crunching lightly on the frosty pavement. Behind him, in the park, the worker kept spreading mulch. Ahead, the town lights flickered on, one window at a time. Somewhere, in one of those houses, someone would be undecorating a tree, sweeping needles from a carpet, complaining mildly about the mess while secretly enjoying the ritual. People were like that. Ed smiled to himself, a small dry expression that might have been missed if anyone had been watching. When next November came, he suspected that if Sarah asked him about the tree, he would sigh, complain about schedules and budgets, and then make another list. Not because he loved Christmas, that would be an exaggeration, but because, for reasons that stretched back through years of hillside weather and family living rooms and illustrated newspapers, people had decided that dragging a tree into a building made winter easier to live with. And if they were going to do that in his building, then by all that was sensible, the tree was going to stand up straight.